Have you ever noticed something strange? The more you chase love, the more someone pulls away. And the more you step back, the more they start to feel you. This isn't confusion, it's human psychology. Because some hearts don't open to pressure, they open to peace. Not to intensity, but to safety. Not to, I need you, but to, I understand you. And if you learn the right words, calm, grounded, and real, you won't chase love anymore. You'll become the place where love finally feels safe enough to stay. What most people misunderstand is that when someone pulls away emotionally, it feels personal, but in reality, it is rarely about you. It is about what their nervous system has learned over time. When we talk about avoidant behavior, we are not talking about someone who doesn't feel deeply. We are talking about someone who often feels too much, too fast, and at some point in their life, that intensity became unsafe. So they adapted. They learned to disconnect before they could be overwhelmed. They learned to create space before they could be hurt. And over time, that space became their identity. So when you approach someone like this with strong emotion, urgency, or neediness, what they don't hear is love. What they feel is pressure. And pressure does not feel like intimacy. To them, it feels like loss of control. It feels like being trapped in something they don't fully understand or feel ready for. And the human nervous system has one primary goal: safety, not happiness, not connection. Safety first. So when their system detects emotional intensity, even if your intention is pure love, their instinct is to step back. This is why labeling them as cold or uninterested misses the truth completely. Because underneath that distance is often a very sensitive emotional system that learned early on. Closeness can lead to disappointment, rejection, or emotional overwhelm. So instead of leaning in when they feel something strong, they learn to lean out, not because they don't see, but because caring once came with emotional cost. Now here is where most people make a critical mistake. They interpret distance as rejection of their value. They start thinking, if they cared, they would stay close. If they loved me, they would respond faster. If I mattered, they wouldn't pull away. And from that belief, they start chasing. They start explaining more, texting more, proving more. But what they don't realize is that every extra attempt, every emotional push, every attempt to fix the distance is actually reinforcing the very thing that caused the withdrawal in the first place: emotional overwhelm. If you want to change the dynamic, you must first change your interpretation of distance. Distance is not always rejection. Sometimes distance is regulation. It is the person trying to find balance inside themselves. It is the nervous system saying, I need space to feel okay again. And when you understand that, your energy changes completely. You stop chasing. You stow. Escalating. You stop reacting. Instead, you become steady. And steadiness is something an avoidant person rarely experiences in emotional relationships, because most people either get close with intensity or leave with frustration. But steadiness is different. Steadiness says, I can care about you without losing myself. I can be connected to you without controlling you. I can be here without chasing you. And that energy is unfamiliar in a safe way. When someone who is avoidant senses that you are not trying to force them into emotional speed, something subtle begins to shift. Their guard does not fall because of persuasion, it softens because of safety. They start to realize they are not being chased. They are not being pressured into a level of emotional availability they are not ready for. And in that absence of pressure, curiosity returns. And where there is curiosity, there is potential for reconnection. But this only works when your understanding is genuine. Because if you are only pretending to be calm while internally panicking, that energy leaks. Humans are incredibly sensitive to emotional inconsistency. So the real transformation is not in your behavior alone, it is in your emotional interpretation. You stop making their distance mean, I am not enough. You start making it mean they are protecting themselves. And that shift removes the emotional charge that fuels anxiety. And when the emotional charge disappears, something powerful happens. You regain control over yourself. Not control over them, but control over your reactions, your urgency, your internal state. And that is the foundation of all strong relationships. Not pursuit, not pressure, not proving, but emotional stability. Because at the deepest level, people don't move toward intensity. They move toward safety. And when you finally understand that avoidance is not rejection, but protection, you stop fighting their nature and you start becoming the kind of presence that does not threaten it. WH. and someone begins to pull away emotionally, most people instinctively do the exact thing that makes the situation worse. They apply more pressure. It doesn't usually look aggressive or intentional. In fact, it often comes from care, fear, or confusion. You notice the distance, and your mind starts searching for certainty. You want clarity. You want reassurance. So you reach out more often. You ask more questions. You try to fix the gap between you and them. But what feels like effort and love from your side often feels like pressure on the other side. Pressure is not always loud. Sometimes it is in the tone of a message that asks for immediate emotional response. Sometimes it is in repeated calls, long explanations, or emotional conversations that demand resolution right now. And the problem is not that connection is wrong, it is the timing and emotional intensity behind it. When someone is already feeling overwhelmed internally, added pressure does not create closeness. It creates contraction. The nervous system interprets intensity as a signal that something is not safe or controllable, and the natural response is to step back to regain balance. This is where most relationships enter a cycle that feels painful but predictable. One person feels distance and increases pursuit. The other person feels pursued and increases withdrawal. The more one reaches, the more the other retreats. And both people start suffering in different ways. One feels abandoned. The other feels suffocated. But neither person is necessarily acting from a lack of care. They are reacting from different emotional thresholds and different internal definitions of safety. If you look closely, pressure is often rooted in fear. Fear of losing connection. Fear of being forgotten, fear of not being important. And when fear drives behavior, it tends to speed things up emotionally. But emotional speed is not the same as emotional depth. Depth requires grounding, patience, and stability. Speed creates noise, urgency and confusion. So while you may believe you are moving closer to someone through urgency, you may actually be moving them further away from you in their internal experience. Now contrast that with safety. Safety does not mean absence of communication. It means absence of emotional threat. It means the other person feels that they are not being forced, judged, cornered, or rushed into a state they are not ready for. Safety sounds like calm consistency. It sounds like presence without demand. It sounds like I am here and I am not trying to control your pace. And this creates a very different emotional response in the human system. When pressure is removed, something subtle begins to happen inside the other person. Their guard does not immediately disappear, but it stops tightening. The emotional system that was preparing to protect itself no longer receives signals of urgency or threat. And in that absence of threat, curiosity begins to return. Curiosity is one of the most powerful emotional gateways to reconnection, because when someone is no longer reacting defensively, they begin to observe again instead of escape. Safety also gives something that pressure never can: space for self-reflection. When a person feels emotionally pressured, their focus is external. They are managing the intensity coming toward them. But when pressure disappears, their focus shifts inward. They start to process their own feelings without interruption. They begin to notice what they miss, what they feel, and what feels meaningful to them. This is where reconnection is actually born, not in pursuit, but in emotional clarity that emerges in calm space. The irony is that safety often creates stronger attraction than pressure ever could, because pressure communicates need, and need can feel heavy. But safety communicates strength, and strength feels stable. And humans are naturally drawn to what feels stable, especially when their internal world is already emotionally sensitive. Stability becomes grounding, predictability becomes comforting, and calm presence becomes memorable. However, creating safety does not mean becoming distant, cold, or emotionally unavailable. That is a misunderstanding many people fall into. Safety is not withdrawal. It is emotional regulation. It is staying connected without escalating intensity. It is responding without panic. It is expressing without overwhelming. It is the ability to remain centered even when the situation is uncertain. And this is where real emotional maturity begins, because it requires you to tolerate discomfort without trying to immediately resolve it through action. It requires you to sit with uncertainty without turning it into pressure. It requires you to trust that connection does not always need to be forced to remain real. When you stop applying pressure, you stop triggering defensive responses. And when defensive responses stop, natural emotional openness has a chance to return. Not because you chased tea, but because you created the conditions for it. And that is the key difference. Pressure tries to force closeness. Safety allows closeness to emerge on its own timeline. In the end, the paradox is simple but powerful. The more you try to force someone to stay close, the more they feel the need to leave. But the more you create emotional safety through calmness, consistency, and self-control, the more likely they are to return on their own terms. Because what the human nervous system truly seeks is not intensity, not urgency, and not persuasion. It seeks peace. Most people think communication is about saying the right words. But in emotionally sensitive dynamics, especially when someone tends toward avoidance, words are not just information. They are signals to the nervous system. And the nervous system does not respond first to logic. It responds first to tone, emotional pressure, and perceived safety. This is why two people can say the same sentence but create completely different emotional reactions. One calms the room. The other creates tension. The difference is not vocabulary, it is regulation. When someone is emotionally withdrawing, the natural reaction for most people is to speak more intensely. They try to close the gap with explanations, emotional expressions, or questions that demand clarity. But in that moment, words stop being communication and start becoming pressure. The more emotionally charged the language becomes, the more the other person's system feels overwhelmed. And when overwhelm rises, clarity does not increase, defensiveness does. This is where the idea of words that regulate instead of chase becomes powerful. Regulating words are not designed to extract a response. They are designed to lower emotional intensity in the space between two people. They are calm, grounded, and free from urgency. They do not say, "You need to fix this now." They say, "I am steady even in uncertainty." And that steadiness is what begins to soften emotional resistance. Ants. For example, instead of saying something like, "Why are you ignoring me?" which carries emotional charge, expectation, and subtle accusation, a regulated response might sound like, "I'm here if and when you feel like talking." The difference is subtle in structure, but massive in emotional impact. One statement pushes for immediate emotional resolution. The other removes pressure entirely while still maintaining presence. One creates contraction. The other creates space. Avoidant individuals are especially sensitive to emotional pressure hidden inside words. Even if the tone is polite, the underlying emotional demand is still felt. So when communication carries urgency, reply now, explain this, what are we? It often triggers a retreat response. Not because the content is wrong, but because the emotional speed is too high. Regulating language slows that speed down. It removes the feeling of being cornered into emotional performance. This does not mean becoming passive or emotive, only disconnected. Regulation is not silence or indifference. It is emotional steadiness expressed through language. It is the ability to acknowledge reality without escalating it. It is saying what is true without attaching urgency to the outcome. For instance, "I value honesty more than confusion" communicates a boundary without pressure. "Take your time, I'm not in a rush" communicates emotional patience without withdrawal. These phrases do not chase attention, they anchor stability. What makes regulating language powerful is that it shifts the emotional experience of the other person from threat-based processing to reflection-based processing. When someone feels pressured, their mind goes into defense mode. They are thinking about escape, justification, or minimizing emotional exposure. But when pressure is removed, their mind has space to observe. And observation is the first step toward reconnection. People cannot reflect deeply while they feel emotionally cornered. There is as well, a deeper layer to this. Regulated language changes your internal state as well. When you stop using words that chase, plead, or demand, you also stop reinforcing anxiety inside yourself. Because chasing language is not just directed outward is often a reflection of internal panic. So when you shift your words to calmness, you are also training your own nervous system to settle. You are no longer communicating from fear, you are communicating from grounded awareness. This is why tone matters more than content. You can say the same sentence with two completely different emotional energies. One version is attached to an outcome. "Please just talk to me." The other is detached but present. "I'm open when you are." The first carries emotional urgency and dependence. The second carries self-respect and calm availability. One tries to pull connection toward you. The other allows connection to exist without force. Over time, this consistency in regulated communication changes the dynamic entirely. The other person begins to associate your presence with emotional safety instead of emotional pressure, and that association is critical because human attachment is not built only on attraction, it is built on how safe someone feels in your emotional presence. If your words consistently reduce tension instead of increasing it, you become a stabilizing force in their emotional world rather than another source of intensity. But perhaps the most important shift is this. Regulated words are not about controlling the other person's reaction. They are about controlling your own emotional expression. You stop using language to extract reassurance. You stop using words to chase clarity at any cost. Instead, you use language to reflect calm truth. And that is what makes it powerful. Because in the end, people do not just respond to what you say. They respond to how your words make their nervous system feel. And when your words consistently bring calm instead of pressure, space instead of demand, and steadiness instead of urgency, you stop pushing people away and start creating the emotional conditions where connection can return naturally, without force. Most people underestimate consistency because it does not create excitement in the short term. Intensity feels powerful. Big emotional moments feel meaningful. Sudden affection feels like love. But the human nervous system does not build long-term trust through intensity, it builds it through predictability. And predictability comes from consistency. Especially in emotionally avoidant dynamics, consistency becomes more important than any emotional peak moment. When someone is emotionally avoidant, their internal world is often shaped by inconsistency in early experiences. This does not always mean trauma in a dramatic sense. It can simply mean that emotional closeness once felt unpredictable, sometimes safe, sometimes overwhelming, sometimes followed by disappointment or emotional pressure. So over time, their system learns to stay alert, not because they don't want connection, but because they don't trust the stability of it. And when a nervous system is constantly scanning for emotional volatility, it will naturally resist intensity and gravitate toward what feels steady. This is where consistency becomes powerful. Consistency is not about doing something big once. It is about doing something stable repeatedly over time. It is the absence of emotional extremes. It is showing up in a way that does not fluctuate based on mood, fear, or reaction. It is communicating, responding, and behaving in a way that feels emotionally even, not overly high, not overly low. Just steady. To an avoidant person, consistency does something very specific. It reduces prediction stress. Their system is constantly trying to answer unconscious questions like, is this safe today? Will this person overwhelm me? Will I be pressured emotionally? Or will this connection suddenly become too intense? When your behavior, ire, is inconsistent, those questions stay active. But when your behavior is steady, those questions begin to quiet. And when the mind is no longer occupied with emotional uncertainty, it can begin to relax. The mistake most people make is trying to create closeness through emotional spikes. They have deep conversations one day, emotional distance the next, then panic-driven messages after that. From their perspective, they are expressing love. But from the other person's nervous system, it feels like instability. And instability is not interpreted as romance, it is interpreted as emotional unpredictability. And unpredictability creates distance, not closeness. Consistency, on the other hand, creates a very different experience. It communicates, my energy does not depend on panic. My presence is not conditional on your immediate response. I do not disappear when I feel uncertain, and I do not overextend when I feel anxious. This kind of emotional stability is rare in highly reactive recovery. Relational patterns, and because it is rare, it becomes noticeable. Over time, consistency builds something intensity cannot. Trust without pressure. Trust without pressure means the other person does not feel forced to open up faster than they are ready. They are not being emotionally pulled. They are not being emotionally chased. Instead, they are observing a pattern that does not harm their sense of control. And when control is not threatened, defensiveness reduces. This is why consistency is not just about what you do, it is about what you stop doing. You stop reacting emotionally to every shift in their behavior. You stop changing your tone based on fear of losing them. You stop overcompensating when they pull back. Instead, you remain emotionally anchored. You respond, but you do not escalate. You engage, but you do not chase. You stay present, but not dependent. And here is where something interesting happens psychologically. When someone experiences consistency over time, their nervous system starts to reclassify the relationship. At first, they may assume emotional withdrawal is necessary for safety, but when they repeatedly experience a presence that does not punish, pressure, or overwhelm them, that assumption begins to weaken. They start to realize that closeness does not automatically equal danger. And that realization is not intellectual, it is physiological. However, consistency also requires patience, because it does not produce immediate results. It does not create sudden emotional breakthroughs. Instead, it creates slow internal recalibration. And most people abandon consistency too early because they mistake lack of immediate response as failure. But emotional trust is not built in days. It is built through repetition over time. There is also an internal benefit to consistency that is often ignored. When you behave consistently, you reduce your own emotional chaos. You are no longer adjusting your entire emotional state based on how someone else behaves. Ease in the moment. You are no longer reacting to every silence or distance with anxiety. Instead, you anchor yourself in your own standard of behavior, and that creates emotional strength. And emotional strength is deeply attractive not in a superficial sense, but in a psychological sense. Because stability is rare, and what is rare becomes valuable in human experience. A person who does not fluctuate emotionally, who does not chase and panic, and who does not disappear in frustration becomes a grounding presence. And grounding presence is what allows emotionally guarded people to slowly soften. In the end, consistency is not about controlling someone else's behavior. It is about becoming someone whose emotional presence does not create confusion. It is about removing volatility from your interactions so that trust has space to grow naturally. And when trust grows without pressure, without urgency, and without emotional chaos, connection stops being something you chase and starts becoming something that unfolds on its own timeline. Silence is one of the most misunderstood tools in emotional communication. Most people interpret silence as rejection, punishment, or loss. So when someone pulls away, the instinct is to fill the silence, immediately send another message, ask another question, or try to reopen the emotional channel. But in emotionally sensitive dynamics, especially with avoidant tendencies, silence is not just the absence of words. It is a message in itself, and depending on how it is used, it can either create distance or restore balance. The key difference is intention. Reactive silence comes from fear or pain. It is the silence of, I am ignoring you because I feel hurt and I want you to feel it. That kind of silence carries emotional charge. It is not calm, it is tension without words. And even without communication, that tension is felt. It does not create safety, it creates uncertainty and emotional suspense. The other person does not feel peace from it. They feel pressure in a different form. But grounded silence is completely different. Grounded silence is not emotional withdrawal as punishment. It is emotional regulation. It is the ability to pause communication without panic, without urgency, and without the need to immediately fix discomfort. It says, I am still here, but I am not going to chase emotional stability outside of myself. And that difference is what makes silence powerful rather than destructive. When someone with avoidant tendencies experiences grounded silence, something important happens internally. The emotional system, which may have been expecting pressure, pursuit, or emotional escalation, stops receiving those signals. And when those signals stop, the nervous system is no longer in a defensive state. Instead of preparing for emotional demand, it begins to settle. This settling is not instant attraction, it is deactivation of stress. Most people think that silence pushes avoidant individuals further away, but it depends entirely on what preceded the silence. If silence follows emotional chasing, desperation, or repeated pressure, then yes, it often reinforces distance because it confirms the need for escape. But if silence follows calm communication and emotional steadiness, it has a different effect. It creates space, and space is where reflection begins. In the absence of emotional pressure, the mind starts doing something it cannot do in the middle of conflict. It processes. When someone is not being actively pursued, their attention is no longer consumed by managing external emotional demands. This creates room for internal thoughts to surface. They begin to notice what they actually feel, what they miss, and what feels uncertain. And that internal awareness is where reconnection quietly begins. Silence also restores emotional balance in you. When you constantly react, respond, and chase clarity, your emotional state becomes dependent on external feedback. Every delay feels like rejectio, and every gap feels like loss. Every unanswered message becomes a trigger. But when you choose silence from a grounded state, you break that cycle. You stop feeding your nervous system constant emotional stimulation. And in that pause, you regain internal control. However, the most important part of silence is that it must not be used as manipulation. The goal is not to make the other person miss you. The goal is not to create anxiety or emotional tension so they return. That approach always backfires because it still comes from emotional dependence. True silence is not about controlling their reaction, it is about stabilizing your own emotional state so you are no longer reacting impulsively. When silence is used correctly, it communicates something powerful without words: emotional independence. It signals that your peace is not entirely dependent on constant interaction. It shows that you are capable of existing without chasing reassurance. And psychologically, this is significant. Because people are not only drawn to those who are present, they are drawn to those who are not emotionally collapsing in their absence. Avoidant individuals in particular are sensitive to emotional pressure, but also sensitive to emotional authenticity. They can often sense when someone is acting from fear versus when someone is simply grounded. Grounded silence does not feel like punishment. It feels like stability. It does not create urgency. It creates space. And in that space, the emotional intensity that once caused withdrawal begins to lose its grip. But silence also requires emotional discipline. Because during silence, the mind will try to pull you back into reaction. It will create stories. They don't care. I need to fix this. If I don't act now, I'll lose them. These thoughts are not truth, they are anxiety patterns. And if you act on them, silence loses its power. It becomes another cycle of pursuit and retreat. Real silence is holding your ground in the presence of discomfort. It is choosing not to respond from emotional impulse. It is allowing uncertainty to exist without immediately trying to eliminate it, and that is one of the most advanced forms of emotional control. Over time, this kind of silence reshapes the dynamic completely. You are no longer the person who reacts to every shift. You become the person who remains steady even when nothing is being said, and that steadiness changes how you are experienced emotionally. You are no longer a source of pressure or emotional urgency. You become a space of calm presence. In the end, silence is not about absence, it is about control. Not control over the other person, but control over your own emotional reactions. When used correctly, it removes pressure from the relationship, restores internal balance, and creates the conditions where genuine reflection can happen. And in emotionally avoidant dynamics, reflection, not pursuit, is what eventually opens the door to reconnection. At the deepest level of emotional relationships, the real conflict is rarely about the other person, it is about your internal state. Most people believe the goal is to get someone back, fix the connection, or make them understand, but that mindset immediately creates dependence. And dependence is exactly what destabilizes emotional dynamics. When your sense of peace is tied to someone else's behavior, you lose the ability to respond clearly, calmly, and strategically. You start reacting instead of leading your own emotional experience. This is why the final and most important shift is not about learning better phrases or timing your communication perfectly. It is about no longer making your emotional stability dependent on the outcome of one person. When you constantly try to fix, chase, or manage someone else's emotional availability, you are not in control, you are being controlled by uncertainty. And uncertainty, when combined with emotional attachment, creates anxiety. That anxiety then drives behavior, or that pushes the very connection you want further away. When you stop trying to win someone emotionally and instead focus on remaining centered, something fundamental changes in your energy. You are no longer communicating from fear of loss. You are communicating from a grounded sense of self. This does not mean you stop caring. It means your care is no longer desperate. It is no longer attached to immediate validation. It becomes stable, quiet, and internally anchored. Avoidant dynamics often trigger a strong internal urge to fix things quickly. The silence feels uncomfortable. The distance feels personal. The lack of clarity feels intolerable. So the mind searches for immediate resolution through action, another message, another explanation, another emotional push. But these actions are not coming from strength, they are coming from discomfort. And anything done from emotional instability tends to amplify instability in return. When you shift your focus from, how do I make them come closer, to how do I stay grounded regardless of what happens, you change the entire structure of the interaction. You are no longer trying to control their emotional availability. You are controlling your own emotional state, and that is the only control you ever truly have. This is where emotional strength becomes more powerful than emotional strategy. Strategy tries to influence outcomes. Strength changes the energy you bring into any outcome. A person who is emotionally grounded does not panic when someone pulls away. They do not over-explain themselves to reduce uncertainty. They do not chase validation to feel secure. Instead, they observe, regulate, and respond only when it aligns with their internal calm. And paradoxically, this emotional independence is what often creates the strongest attraction, not because it is a technique, but because it reflects psychological safety. Humans are naturally drawn to stability because stability reduces internal stress. When someone is named emotionally reactive, not easily shaken, and not dependent on immediate reassurance, they become emotionally safe to be around. And safety is the foundation of all sustainable connection. But the deeper transformation happens inside you. When you stop making another person the center of your emotional regulation, you reclaim your attention. You stop checking messages as a source of self-worth. You stop interpreting silence as personal failure. You stop measuring your value based on someone else's responsiveness. Instead, your focus returns to your own life, your own direction, and your own emotional clarity. This is not detachment in a cold or indifferent sense. It is detachment from emotional chaos. You can still care, but you are no longer consumed. You can still feel, but you are no longer destabilized. You can still connect, but you are no longer chasing. This is what emotional grounding looks like. It is presence without dependency. And when you operate from this state, your decisions become different. You no longer overinvest in uncertainty. You no longer try to force emotional clarity from someone who is not ready to give it. You no longer abandon your own needs just to maintain temporary connection. Instead, you begin to choose based on alignment, not fear. This shift also changes how you interpret relationships. Instead of seeing distance as something that must be fixed immediately, you begin to see it as information. Instead of reacting emotionally to every fluctuation, you begin to observe patterns. And instead of trying to hold on to every connection, you begin to recognize which ones are mutual and which ones are one-sided. The strongest emotional position you can reach is not pursuit and not avoidance, it is centered awareness. In this state, you are not chasing anyone, but you are also not abandoning yourself. You are simply observing reality clearly and responding from stability. And from that place, your actions become intentional instead of reactive. Ultimately, the goal is not to become someone who can win emotionally unavailable people. The goal is to become someone who is no longer emotionally destabilized by emotional unavailability. Because once you are no longer reactive, you are no longer trapped in cycles of pursuit and withdrawal. You regain your clarity, your direction, and your self-respect, and that is the real turning point. When your emotional world stops revolving around someone else's availability and starts revolving around your own stability. From there, every decision becomes clearer, every interaction becomes calmer, and every connection, if it continues, does so from strength rather than need.